Sometimes, the very things we cherish most are the ones that break our hearts. Margaret Stone had watched her family's mill crumble for over 20 years, while the townspeople whispered that she was a fool for refusing to give it up. The old structure stood silent against the mountain sky, its great wooden wheel motionless since her father's death. Every month, new bills arrived, bills she couldn't pay, while neighbors said she was wasting her life on worthless ruins. Yet Margaret held on. Something deep inside told her this place still mattered. Her 12-year-old son, Samuel, was untouched by the opinions of others. He loved roaming through the mill, running his fingers along the weathered beams, listening to the creak rushing underneath. Where others saw decay, Samuel found beauty. Where others saw failure, he saw possibility. But what secret had Samuel's great-grandfather hidden within those wooden walls? One that could turn the most ridiculed family in town into millionaires? Before we continue, let us know where you're listening from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow, something very special awaits. That morning, a lingering mist hung over Pine Ridge Valley, like an old friend unwilling to leave. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the first rays of sunlight break through and illuminate the stone foundation of the family mill. Weathered by decades, the building had stood silent for 20 years, its massive waterwheel frozen in time. Yet it still dominated the landscape with a quiet determination that reminded her of her father. She poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, one of the last pieces from her grandmother's porcelain set, and allowed herself this daily ritual of remembrance. Once the mill had been the beating heart of their mountain community, grinding grain for families across the valley. Her great-grandfather had built it in 1892 with his own hands, choosing this bend in Clear Creek for its endless flow of water year-round. Margaret's father used to tell stories about the mill's golden years, Saturday mornings when wagons lined the road, and the sound of grinding stones carried for miles. Back then, the stone name meant respect in Pine Ridge Valley. Now, to most, it meant stubborn folly. "Mom, can I go to the mill after breakfast?" Samuel appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, eyes sharp and curious, the same eyes that painfully reminded Margaret of her late husband. At 12, Samuel carried an old soul, able to grasp things far beyond his years. While other children were lost in video games and social media, Samuel delighted in studying the mill's ancient mechanisms, sketching how morning light filtered through its broken windows. "You remember the rules?" Margaret asked, stepping away from the window. "Stay clear of the loose boards on the second floor, and don't go near the wheel box without me." Samuel nodded eagerly, already reaching for his worn notebook, filled with careful sketches and observations. He had already filled 3 journals with diagrams and notes, treating the old building like an intricate puzzle waiting to be solved. Margaret hadn't found the courage to tell him that some puzzles were never meant to be solved, only remembered. The crunch of gravel in the driveway pulled her from her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Emma Caldwell climbing out of her pickup, a casserole dish balanced in her hands. Emma had been Margaret's closest friend since childhood, one of the few who didn't think she'd lost her mind for refusing to sell the old mill property. "Good morning, Margaret," Emma called, knocking on the kitchen door. "Brought you some of that cornbread you like." Margaret opened the door with a grateful smile. Emma's presence always brought warmth to her modest home, and her steady, practical nature had a way of grounding Margaret's more turbulent emotions about the mill. "You don't have to keep feeding us," Margaret said, already making room on the counter for the dish. "Nonsense. And besides, I needed an excuse to check in," Emma replied, settling comfortably into a kitchen chair with the ease of long friendship. So, how are things, really? Margaret's gaze drifted toward the living room, where Samuel was gathering his notebook and pencils. Harrison from the bank called yesterday. Emma's expression darkened. Thomas Harrison had been bank president for 5 years, ever since moving from the city to Pine Ridge Valley. His predecessor had been a kind man who'd known Margaret's family for generations. Harrison, however, approached every interaction with cold, measured efficiency. What did he want this time? The usual, reminding me property taxes are overdue, the mill's a safety hazard, and that I'm unrealistic about its value. Margaret's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd had the same conversation far too many times. He says there's another buyer, a development company from Denver. A development company? Emma frowned. What would they want with the mill property? Harrison claims they're looking for mountain sites with water access, probably for vacation homes or a resort. Margaret shrugged, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. He made it sound like I'd be crazy not to take their offer. Samuel appeared in the doorway, notebook tucked under his arm. Can I head out now, Mom? Margaret nodded, watching her son leave with his usual spark of enthusiasm. Despite the financial strain, the small-town gossip, and the constant uncertainty, Samuel never lost his fascination with the mill. Sometimes Margaret wondered if clinging to the place was selfish, when selling it might give her boy a more stable future. That one's special, Emma remarked, following him with her eyes as he disappeared down the path to the mill. The way he looks at that old building, you'd think he sees something the rest of us can't. Pouring coffee for her friend, Margaret sat down across from her. His father was the same. David always said the mill had stories to tell, if you just knew how to listen. Emma reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. David would be proud of you for keeping it in the family. Would he? Margaret's voice trembled. Sometimes I think I'm just being stubborn. The mill hasn't turned a profit since my father died. The machinery's beyond repair, and I have no money to restore it. Maybe Harrison's right. Maybe I am being unrealistic. Listen to me, Margaret Stone, Emma said firmly. Your great-grandfather didn't build that mill to make money. He built it to serve the community, to create something that would last. Your father understood that, and so did David. Just because the world has changed doesn't mean the mill's purpose has to change with it. Margaret wanted to believe her friend's words, but the pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter told another story. Property taxes, insurance, basic upkeep. It all cost more than her part-time job at the county library could ever cover. For 3 years now, she had been relying on David's modest life insurance policy, and that source was nearly gone. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and sighed. Harrison again? Emma asked. Margaret nodded and let it go to voicemail. She already knew what he would say, the same thing he'd been repeating for months. The property was a financial burden. The mill was unsafe. The developer's offer was generous, and it wouldn't stay on the table forever. He's not going to give up, said Margaret. And neither will you, Emma replied with confidence. You've got Stone blood in your veins. Your great-grandfather didn't back down when the railroad tried to buy him out. Your father stood his ground through the drought of '78, and you're not about to give up now. Margaret treasured Emma's faith in her, but reality weighed heavily. Samuel would start high school in a few years. Then, if she could manage it, college. He was bright, brilliantly so, and deserved opportunities beyond what Pine Ridge Valley could offer. How could she justify clinging to a crumbling mill when selling it might secure his future. Through the window, she saw Samuel sitting on the front steps of the mill, sketching in his notebook with deep concentration. The sight made her heart ache, love and uncertainty intertwining in equal measure. "Emma," she said softly, "what if I'm wrong? What if keeping the mill is just selfishness dressed up as sentiment?" Her friend was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Margaret, I've known you since we were Samuel's age. You are one of the most selfless people I've ever met. If you're holding on to that mill, it's not out of selfishness. It's because deep down you know it still has a purpose." Margaret nodded, though the doubt didn't fade. The mill did seem to have a purpose, as if it were waiting for something. But waiting for what? And how much longer could she wait with debts rising and Harrison pressing harder every week? As if summoned by her thoughts, Samuel came running up the path from the mill, cheeks flushed with excitement, holding his notebook tight against his chest. "Mom! Emma!" he called as he burst through the kitchen door. "You've got to see what I found." Margaret and Emma exchanged a glance. Samuel's discoveries usually involved curious rock formations or unusual bird nests, the kind of treasures 12-year-olds cherish, but adults politely smile at. "What is it, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, matching his enthusiasm. Samuel opened the notebook and carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges brittle. "It was hidden behind a loose stone in the mill's foundation," he explained, his eyes shining. "I was sketching the masonry when I noticed this piece was different from the others." Margaret took the paper delicately, unfolding it with care. The handwriting was faded, yet still legible, a style she recognized instantly from old family letters. It was her great-grandfather's. "What does it say?" Emma leaned in closer. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she began to read aloud. "To my descendants who bear the name Stone, this mill holds more than memories. What feeds the body may also nourish the soul, but only those who understand the mill's true purpose will uncover its priceless treasure. Do not search among the grinding stones, but beneath the wheel. The water knows the way." The kitchen fell silent, broken only by the steady ticking of the wall clock. Margaret read the note twice more, her mind struggling to take it in. "Great-grandfather wrote this," she whispered. Samuel's eyes were bright. "It even has his signature at the bottom. Look, Jeremiah Stone, 1943. Emma studied the paper. "A priceless treasure. What do you think he meant?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "I don't know. Father never mentioned anything about him hiding something in the mill." "Maybe he didn't know," Samuel suggested. "Maybe great-grandfather kept it secret for a reason." Margaret glanced at her son's eager face, feeling her heart sink. She recognized that look. It was the same one David used to have when he spoke of restoring the mill to its former glory. The look of someone who believed in possibilities. "Samuel, darling," she began gently. "Sometimes old papers like this are just—" "Mom, listen!" Samuel interrupted, his voice unusually firm. "I've studied the mill's construction for 2 years. I know every stone, every beam, every part of that building. This note was hidden deliberately. Great-grandfather wanted someone to find it." Emma read over the words again. "The water knows the way." That's an interesting line. Your great-grandfather was known for his wisdom, Margaret. He wouldn't have written it without purpose. Margaret wanted to dismiss it as harmless romantic nonsense, but something about his words stirred a memory. Her father once saying Jeremiah Stone had been an extraordinary man, thoughtful, deliberate, a planner. He had built the mill to last generations, choosing materials and methods far beyond what was necessary. "What do you think we should do?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Samuel's eyes lit up. "We have to find out. We need to see what's under the wheel." Margaret looked to Emma, who gave a small, encouraging nod. It wouldn't hurt to take a look, would it? And maybe it could help her decide the mill's future, whether to keep it or let it go. That afternoon, Margaret stood beside the old waterwheel for the first time in months. She usually avoided this part of the mill. The sight of the once vital, living structure, now motionless and overgrown with moss, always filled her with a certain shortness. Samuel crouched near the wheel's base, examining the stone foundation with the intensity of an archaeologist. "Look at this, Mom." The masonry here was unlike the rest of the old mill. These blocks were larger, fitted together in a way that spoke of deliberate craftsmanship. Margaret knelt beside her son, running her fingertips over the worn stones. He was right. The construction here seemed more elaborate, carefully planned. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Samuel flipped through his notebook filled with detailed sketches. "I think great-grandfather built something special here, something he wanted to protect." As Margaret studied her son's drawings, an emotion long forgotten stirred within her. Hope. Perhaps Emma had been right. Perhaps the mill still had a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, her great-grandfather had left them more than fading memories. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the mill's facade. Margaret knew they should head home, yet something held her there, beside the silent wheel. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "we'll come back and look more closely." Samuel smiled, carefully tucking the old letter back into his notebook. As they walked toward the house, Margaret felt on the edge of something significant. She had no idea what they might find beneath that water wheel, but for the first time in years, she looked forward to what the morning might bring. Behind them, the mill stood against the darkening sky, keeping its secrets for another night. The next morning arrived with the crisp freshness of mountain air, making everything feel possible. Margaret had barely slept, her mind turning over her great-grandfather's words. "What lies beneath the wheel? The water knows the way." She had stared at the ceiling for hours, caught between excitement and doubt, wondering if she was walking into some foolish whim or something far more meaningful. Samuel was already dressed and waiting in the kitchen when she came downstairs. A notebook and a small flashlight lay neatly on the table, ready for an expedition. "I've been thinking about the letter all night," he said, eyes bright. "The water knows the way. What if great-grandfather meant the stream itself? What if there's something where the water meets the wheel?" Margaret poured herself coffee, studying her son's eager face. At 12, Samuel possessed a logical mind that often impressed adults. His teachers frequently remarked on his unusual knack for spotting patterns and connections others missed. "All right," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "After breakfast, we'll take a closer look." They walked together to the mill, morning dew clinging to the tall grass around the building's foundation. The water wheel loomed before them, 9 meters across, crafted from oak that had weathered to a silver-gray patina. Even at rest, it exuded a quiet dignity. Samuel immediately crouched at the wheel's base where it met the stream. Water flowed beneath the structure, through a carefully designed stone channel, one his great-grandfather had carved into the creek bed itself. "Mom, look at this!" he called, voice bright with discovery. Margaret hurried to where her son was kneeling beside the stone-lined watercourse. Samuel pointed to what looked like a small symbol carved into one of the foundation stones, a simple design resembling a mill wheel with water flowing beneath it. "I never noticed that before," Margaret murmured, running her fingers over the carving. "It was covered with moss and mud," Samuel explained. "But once I cleaned it," he brushed away more debris, revealing that the symbol was actually part of a larger engraving. Additional markings emerged, an arrow pointing downstream, and beneath it, a series of tiny signs that might have been numbers or letters. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't a coincidence. Her great-grandfather had marked this spot on purpose. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Samuel studied the letter again, reading slowly and with care. "Do not seek what you desire in the grinding stones, but beneath the wheel. The water knows the way." He looked up at Margaret, excitement building in his eyes. "What if there's something hidden in the channel, under the water?" Margaret glanced at the stream passing under the mill wheel. The water was clear, but deep enough to obscure the bottom. The channel was perhaps 4 feet wide and had been skillfully carved to guide the current with precision. "It would have to be something waterproof," she mused, "something that could survive underwater for decades." Samuel was already rolling up his sleeves. "Wait, Samuel." But he was already wading into the stream, the icy mountain water swirling nearly to his knees. Margaret watched anxiously as he felt along the stone bed, tracing the line of the carved symbols. "The stones here are different," Samuel called over the rush of water. "This isn't the natural riverbed. Great-grandfather placed these stones deliberately." Margaret quickly removed her shoes and joined him, gasping as the cold bit into her skin. Side by side, they searched the carefully constructed channel, their fingers probing for anything that didn't belong. "Here!" Samuel's voice was triumphant. "There's something!" Margaret waded to him. Beneath the water, wedged between two large foundation stones, her hand found the smooth, hard edge of something wrapped in oilcloth or leather. Working together, they wrestled it free. It was a package about the size of a book, sealed in an oil-treated leather pouch that had protected it from the stream's relentless flow for decades. Dripping wet and shivering, they climbed out of the water and sat on a nearby log, but their excitement far outweighed their discomfort. Margaret carefully unwrapped the pouch, revealing a handwritten letter from her great-grandfather, along with what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "My dear descendants," Margaret read aloud, her voice trembling. "If you have found this message, then you possess the persistence and wisdom I hoped would run in our family's blood. The mill I built serves a purpose far beyond grinding grain, a truth only a handful will ever know." Margaret paused, her gaze resting on Samuel's bandaged face before continuing. "In the lean years of the 1930s, I discovered our mountain held greater riches than most would dream. The stream feeding the mill bore more than phthirone. It carried traces of silver and gold from far upstream. For 2 decades, I quietly gathered all the mountain offered, securing it for a time when our family might truly need it." Her hands trembled as she read on. "What I have hidden will safeguard generations, if used wisely. But it must remain secret until the right moment. Trust no one beyond our family. The mill's true treasure is not confined to a single cache, but woven into a system I designed. Use the map to find the first hiding place. Each discovery will lead you onward, until you've claimed all that I set aside for you. The letter was signed and dated, Jeremiah Stone, October 15th, 1943. Samuel leaned in to study the map. It charted the mill property in meticulous detail, marked with landmarks and a strange series of connected symbols, each leading to the next. "Mother," he whispered, "grandfather was telling the truth? There's really a treasure?" Margaret stared at the documents in her hands, her mind spinning. Could it be possible? Had her grandfather truly secreted away a fortune somewhere on their land? The rational part of her insisted it was a fanciful notion, yet the evidence lay right before her. "What do we do now?" Samuel asked. Before she could answer, the rumble of an engine broke through the stillness. Beyond the trees, a black sedan rolled into the driveway. Even from a distance, she recognized it. It belonged to Thomas Harrison from the bank. "Quick!" Margaret hissed, carefully wrapping the documents in their leather satchel. "No one can see this." They hurried back toward the house, her thoughts racing. Harrison showing up at this exact moment could not be coincidence. He had been pressuring her to sell for months, and now, right after their remarkable discovery, he arrived unannounced. Harrison waited on the front porch when they emerged from the trees. His tailored suit looked strangely out of place in the rugged mountain setting. A lean man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and cool, calculating eyes that seemed to measure everything in dollars and cents. "Miss Stone," he said with his rehearsed smile, "I hope you don't mind me coming without warning. I have news you'll want to hear." Margaret forced herself to return the smile, discreetly passing the leather satchel to Samuel behind her back. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. What can I do for you?" "The development company I mentioned has raised its offer," Harrison said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "They're now willing to pay $300,000 for the mill property. Cash, with closing in 30 days. Margaret's breath caught. $300,000, a sum beyond anything she'd imagined. Enough to erase her debts and secure Samuel's future. "That is very generous," she managed to say. "Indeed it is," Harrison replied with a crisp nod. "Truthfully, it's probably more than the property is worth," Harrison said, his voice deliberate. "But they're eager to close quickly. I'd hate to see you lose this chance, especially given your current financial situation." There was something in his tone that made Margaret uneasy, a subtle pressure, almost a veiled threat. "I'll need some time to think," she replied. Harrison's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Of course, but I should mention, the offer has an expiration date. They need your answer by the end of the week." Once Harrison left, Margaret and Samuel sat together in the kitchen, the worn leather satchel resting between them on the table. His visit had stirred a fresh urgency into their already difficult circumstances. "Mom," Samuel whispered, "we need to follow the map. We have to find whatever great-grandfather left for us." Margaret gave a slow nod, though anxiety thudded in her chest. In just 2 days, her quiet life had been turned on its head. She now found herself poised between a possible family fortune and growing pressure to sell the very land where it might be hidden. "Yes," she said at last, "we have to know the truth. But Samuel, no one else can know. Not yet. Not until we understand exactly what we're dealing with." Samuel nodded solemnly, grasping the weight of her words despite his youth. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the mill outside, its familiar silhouette suddenly heavy with new meaning. Her great-grandfather had been a cautious, deliberate man. If he had hidden something of value, There was a reason for it, and Harrison's urgency suggested there might be far more at stake than a simple business deal. The coming days would decide whether the Stone family's fate was about to change forever. That night, Margaret studied her great-grandfather's map under the warm glow of the desk lamp, tracing its intricate markings with her fingertips while Samuel slept nearby. The hand-drawn diagram was precise. Every building, every tree, every notable rock formation on their land, carefully recorded. But it was the chain of interlinked symbols that held her attention. They formed a route, beginning at the mill and weaving through several points scattered across the 20-acre property. The first symbol seemed to indicate the old mill office, a small stone building that had once served as her great-grandfather's workspace. Margaret had barely entered it since her father's death, reluctant to disturb what felt like a sacred space in the family's history. Early the next morning, she and Samuel made their way to the office. Unlike the mill's main structure, the office was built entirely of stone, its thick walls and slate roof having endured the years remarkably well. Margaret retrieved the brass key from her father's keyring, noting how easily it turned in the lock despite the long neglect. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood and leather. Dust motes drifted in the morning sunlight, filtering through the small windows. Her great-grandfather's massive oak desk dominated the room, a piece her father had once called built to last forever. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with old farming journals, ledgers, and technical manuals from the mill's earliest days. "According to the map," Samuel said softly, "we should be looking for something marked with the same symbol we saw on the waterwheel." Consulting the leather-bound documents, they worked methodically, scanning every surface for carved or painted symbols. Margaret opened the desk drawers while Samuel checked the lower shelves and the floor. It was Samuel who spotted a small carving in the wooden panel beneath the desk's bottom drawer. "Mom, here," he said, pointing to a symbol identical to the one they had found near the stream. It was discreetly etched into the wood, normally hidden from sight by the chair. Margaret knelt beside him, running her fingers over the engraving. "There must be something here. Help me move the desk." Together, they managed to shift the heavy desk just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Set into the stone floor was a small compartment covered by a slab that blended perfectly with its surroundings. They lifted the stone to uncover a cache containing several items wrapped in oilcloth. Margaret's hands trembled as she unwrapped the first bundle. Inside were rolled papers, apparently the original architectural plans for the mill. But they were not the simple blueprints she had expected. These plans displayed a level of detail and complexity that hinted at engineering far beyond mere grain processing. "Look at this," Samuel exclaimed, spreading the papers across the desk. "There are chambers and secret passages I never even knew existed." Margaret studied the plans with growing astonishment. They revealed multiple concealed spaces, rooms set within walls, passages linking different levels, and, most intriguing of all, what appeared to be an underground storage area beneath the main milling floor. "My great-grandfather built this place like a fortress," she murmured. "But why?" Samuel traced a finger along a series of dotted lines that seemed to mark hidden pathways. Maybe he needed to keep things safe. During the Depression, people couldn't always trust banks, or even neighbors. The second bundle held a detailed journal written in her great-grandfather's precise hand. Margaret gently opened it, reading the first entry, dated September 3, 1933. "The price of gold has risen again," she read aloud. "Government monetary policies have created opportunities for those wise enough to see them. The stream continues to yield modest color, and I've identified several promising sites upstream. Anna worries about my secrecy, but these are dangerous times for a man with resources. Turning the pages, Margaret found each entry meticulously recording her great-grandfather's steady accumulation of precious metals. He had clearly gathered gold and silver for years, using his deep knowledge of local geology and stream patterns, skills few others possessed. He was mining, Samuel said with excitement. Great-grandfather was secretly extracting gold and silver from our land. The journal painted the portrait of a man who understood that economic uncertainty demanded preparation. Jeremiah Stone had seen banks collapse during the Depression and resolved to create his own form of security, not by hoarding cash, but by investing in precious metals. He concealed his wealth within the intricate hidden spaces of the mill. "Listen to this note," Margaret said, finding an entry dated October 1943. "I have completed the final hideaway. The system was now prepared to provide for my descendants whenever they might need it. Each location held enough to ensure comfort, yet the true wealth lay in the entirety of what had been amassed. I prayed my family would be worthy of such trust." A sudden knock at the office door made them both jump. Margaret swiftly gathered the documents while Samuel peeked out through the window. "It's Emma," he announced with relief. Margaret opened the door to find her friend standing there with a thermos in hand and a concerned look. "I saw you come in early," Emma said, "and thought you might need some coffee. Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret glanced at Samuel, who gave a subtle nod. They had agreed the night before that Emma could be trusted with their secret, if it came to that. "Emma," Margaret began cautiously, "what do you know about my great-grandfather's business dealings during the Depression?" Emma stepped inside, setting the thermos on the table. "Jeremiah Stone? Well, I know he was one of the few in the valley who seemed to weather those hard times without much trouble. My grandmother used to say he had a gift for making money when everyone else was losing it." "Did anyone ever suspect he was involved in mining?" Emma raised her eyebrows. "Mining? Not that I've ever heard. Now that you mention it, he did spend an awful lot of time in the mountains. People thought he was hunting or tending to livestock." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "Why are you asking?" Margaret made up her mind. "Because we found this." She showed Emma the diary and the blueprints, watching her friend's expression shift from curiosity to astonishment as she took in what she was seeing. "My God," Emma whispered. "Are you telling me Jeremiah Stone was secretly mining precious metals?" "It appears so," Margaret replied. "And according to this diary, he hid substantial amounts throughout the property." Emma sank into a chair, eyes scanning the architectural plans. "No wonder Harrison has been so determined to buy this place." "If there are rumors about mineral deposits, what exactly do you mean?" Samuel asked. Emma looked up from the plans. "Thomas Harrison isn't from here like the rest of us. He moved to Pine Ridge Valley from Denver 5 years ago. Folks thought he just wanted to work at a small-town bank. But maybe he had other reasons for coming." A chill of realization ran through Margaret. "Do you think he knows about the mining potential? It feels far too convenient for a city banker to suddenly take an interest in rural land with no apparent value beyond sentiment." Samuel, still studying the diary, spoke up. "Mom, look at this note from 1942. Great-grandfather wrote about visitors asking questions about the mills, the water rights, and the mineral claims." Margaret read the passage he pointed out. Her great-grandfather had described strangers from mining companies trying to buy the mineral rights to his land. He had turned down every offer, but his entries suggested growing vigilance in protecting his secret operations and concern over outside interest. Even back then, it was clear to Margaret that this was why he had created such an elaborate system to hide everything. Emma stood, her expression resolute. Margaret, you need to be extremely careful with whatever you decide to do. If there really is treasure hidden on this property, and if Harrison suspects it, you could be in far more danger than you realize. Margaret nodded slowly, fully grasping the gravity of the situation. They were no longer just dealing with the family's past. They might very well be sitting on valuables others would go to great lengths to possess. We need to find out exactly what great-grandfather left for us, Margaret said. But we must do it quietly and quickly. Samuel carefully folded the blueprints. According to the map, the next site is in the mill's main building. There should be a hidden chamber behind the primary grinding stones. Margaret glanced at her son and her closest friend, feeling the weight of decisions that could shape all their futures. Then that's where we go next. The mill looked different now that Margaret knew its secrets. What had once seemed like a simple grain-grinding structure had become an intricate labyrinth of hidden purposes. Inside, in the dim light, she and Samuel stood before the massive millstones, studying the blueprints by flashlight. The plans indicated a concealed chamber behind the eastern stone, accessible through a mechanism built into the stone foundation. Running his hands over the wide circular slabs, Samuel searched for anything that might serve as a trigger. "The drawings mark something right here," he said, pointing to a precise section. "Some sort of rotary mechanism." Margaret examined the stone closely. The morning light streaming through the high windows revealed subtleties in the masonry. One section had been assembled differently, with smaller stones forming an almost decorative pattern. "Try pressing the stones in that pattern," she suggested. Great-grandfather would have designed it to look natural, operable only by someone who knew the secret. Methodically, Samuel began pressing each stone. On the seventh try, they heard a faint grinding sound, and part of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. "It worked!" His voice echoed in the newly revealed space. Margaret shone the light inside. The chamber was narrow, barely 2 meters deep and just over a meter wide. Inside were several wooden crates and what appeared to be more documents wrapped in protective coverings. They brought the crates into the daylight, Margaret's pulse quickening. The first was heavier than expected. When Samuel pried open the lid, they both froze in astonishment. Neatly stored in fitted compartments were old mining tools, a pan, small pickaxes, shovels, and what looked like a mercury amalgamation kit. But it was the cluster of small glass vials that caught Margaret's eye. Each one held what looked like fine gold flakes and specks of silver, meticulously labeled with dates and locations. "Great-grandfather really was a miner," Samuel murmured, turning a vial so the sunlight glinted off its contents. "And he kept precise records of everything he found." The second crate held more mining equipment, specialized instruments that spoke of advanced geological knowledge. Margaret recognized a compass, surveying gear, and tools for rock analysis. Her great-grandfather hadn't been panning for gold as a pastime. He had been running a systematic mining operation. "Take a look at this," Samuel said, carefully unwrapping one of the document bundles. "It's a map of the entire mountain region, with mineral deposits marked." Margaret studied it, her astonishment growing with every detail. Jeremiah Stone had pinpointed dozens of potential mining sites across the Pennyride Valley, complete with notes on soil composition, water flow patterns, and seasonal accessibility. The precision rivaled that of professional mining operations. According to these notes, Margaret read from an accompanying paper, he believed a major silver vein ran straight through our property and extended into the national forest. Samuel traced the line of the marked vein with his finger. If that's true, it would explain why the development company is so desperate to buy our land. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Harrison and his company knew about the mineral potential, their interest wasn't just about building vacation homes. They were positioning themselves to claim valuable mining rights. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with, Margaret said firmly. These mining tools and samples prove that great-grandfather was finding precious metals. But how much did he actually uncover? Samuel's attention shifted to the treasure map they had found by the creek. According to this, there are 6 more marked sites on our property. The mining equipment could be just the beginning. A mix of excitement and unease washed over Margaret. Every discovery increased both the promise of great wealth and the risk that accompanied it. If these mineral deposits truly existed, selling to Harrison's company would mean walking away from a fortune. We need a specialist, she realized aloud. Someone who can tell us exactly what we're looking at. How about Dr. Wells? Samuel suggested. She knows the entire local history. Maybe she has insights into my great-grandfather's activities. Patricia Wells lived in a modest home near the center of town, surrounded by gardens that revealed her love for the local flora. Margaret had known her for years, the unofficial historian of the valley and a retired geology professor. If anyone could provide context, it was Dr. Wells. They found her tending to her herb garden, a weathered sun hat resting over her silver hair. She was past 70, but her energy and curiosity felt decades younger. Margaret? Samuel? She greeted warmly. What brings you here on such a beautiful morning? Margaret glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then carefully explained everything they had discovered. Dr. Wells listened intently, her fascination deepening, occasionally asking questions that revealed her sharp grasp of local geology and history. Your great-grandfather was quite a remarkable man, she said when Margaret finished. I've always suspected he knew more about these mountains than he let on. Did you know he was a miner? Samuel asked. A mysterious smile touched her lips. I had my suspicions. Jeremiah Stone was one of the few people in the valley who seemed untouched by the Depression, and he had a peculiar interest in geological surveys, unusual for someone supposedly just growing grain. She led them into her study, pulling several hefty books and geological maps from the shelves. Pine Ridge Valley sits atop some of the most intriguing mineral formations in this part of Colorado. Most people never notice it. The signs are subtle. But this region is laced with deposits of precious metals. Dr. Wells unfolded a professional geological survey map, her finger tracing several marked locations. See these formations? She said. They suggest potential deposits of silver and gold. Your family's land sits right in the middle of what could be a highly mineral-rich zone. Margaret leaned over the map, her eyes catching the way those marked areas aligned perfectly with the handwritten notes left by her great-grandfather. So he was right about the mineral potential? She asked. More than right, Dr. Wells replied with certainty. He was conducting legitimate geological research decades before official surveys confirmed what he'd already discovered. Samuel presented some of the mineral samples they had found. The elderly woman examined them with practiced skill, peering through a magnifying lens and jotting remarks into a small notebook. These samples contain a notable amount of silver, she announced after a long moment of study. And this gold, though in a small quantity, appears to be of high quality. Your great-grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret felt a mix of vindication and apprehension. Dr. Wells, if our property truly holds valuable minerals, what should we do? The older woman's expression grew serious. That depends on several factors. Do you legally own the mineral rights? Are you ready to handle the legal and operational complexities of mining? And most importantly, who else knows about this potential wealth? Margaret explained Harrison's persistent attempts to buy the land and his connection to the Denver Development Company. Dr. Wells gave a knowing nod. I feared as much. Thomas Harrison has been asking questions about local geology and mineral rights. At first I thought it was casual curiosity, but now I suspect he has inside information. Inside information? Samuel asked. Geological surveys, mining reports, perhaps even historical records that most people don't know exist, Dr. Wells explained. If Harrison represents investors focused on acquiring mineral rights, they may have conducted thorough research before approaching you. Margaret realized the situation was rapidly growing more complicated. They were no longer dealing with a simple family treasure. They might be sitting atop mineral rights worth far more than Harrison's company was offering. What would you recommend? She asked. Dr. Wells paused, choosing her words carefully. First, finish mapping your great-grandfather's treasure. Understanding exactly what he left you will guide your decisions. Second, seek legal advice on mineral rights and property law. And third, she met Margaret's gaze. Be very careful about whom you trust. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Wells gently pulled Margaret aside. Your great-grandfather was a wise man who thought far ahead. He wouldn't have created such an elaborate system unless he believed your family would one day need it. Don't let anyone pressure you into a decision before you fully understand what you might be giving up. Walking back to the property, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Samuel's excitement was infectious, but she couldn't ignore the dangers lurking beneath their discovery. If her land truly held valuable mineral deposits, and if Harrison had already suspected their worth, they would need to move quickly, and with great caution. Tomorrow, Margaret told Samuel, her voice firm, we'll follow the map to the next location. But from now on, we tell no one what we find. No one. Samuel nodded solemnly, sensing that their treasure hunt had transformed into something far more serious than either of them had imagined. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea beside her, studying the coded ledger they had discovered in the mill's hidden chamber. The pages were filled with her great-grandfather's meticulous handwriting, yet the entries were written in a mysterious system of numbers and symbols that defied easy interpretation. Samuel had gone to bed, worn out from the day's revelations, but Margaret felt too energized to sleep. The ledger clearly recorded financial transactions, though the amounts were encrypted in a code meant to shield the information from casual eyes. She had always known her great-grandfather was methodical, but the intricate complexity of his record-keeping revealed a level of caution born from dangerous times. In the depths of the Depression, a man holding a hidden fortune needed to be exceptionally careful to guard his secrets. Margaret traced a finger over one page, noting recurring patterns, certain symbols appearing again and again, often followed by numbers that might represent dates, quantities, or locations. If she could crack the code, she might finally uncover the full scope of what Jeremiah Stone had amassed. A soft knock at the kitchen door broke her concentration. She glanced at the clock, just shy of 10 p.m., an unusual hour for visitors in Pine Ridge Valley. Approaching with care, she peered through the window and saw Emma standing on the porch. "Sorry to bother you so late," Emma said as Margaret opened the door, "but I couldn't stop thinking about what you showed me today. I remembered something that might matter." Margaret invited her in, grateful for the company and curious about Emma's recollection. "After you left this afternoon, I called my grandmother," Emma began, settling into a kitchen chair. "She's 93 now, but her memory of the old days is still sharp. I asked her about Jeremiah Stone and what he did during the Depression." Margaret poured her friend a cup of tea and waited. "She told me something interesting," Emma continued. "She remembered your great-grandfather disappearing for days at a time, supposedly to check the cattle in the high pastures. But he never took a horse or a pack mule, just a small rucksack and his walking stick." "That does sound unusual for tending cattle," Margaret agreed. "Here's the really strange part." Emma leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Grandma said he always came back with the rucksack heavier than when he left. She noticed because she would watch him from their kitchen window as he passed by the farm." A chill of excitement swept through Margaret. He was bringing something down from the mountains. "That's what I thought too." Emma's eyes held a spark. "And there's more. Grandma said that during the worst years of the Depression, when other families struggled to afford even the basics, your great-grandfather always seemed to have money. He loaned funds to several families when the bank either couldn't or wouldn't help." Margaret sat back, turning over the implications in her mind. Jeremiah Stone had a habit of bringing valuable materials down from the mountains. He also helped members of the community quietly, offering financial aid when needed. If he kept doing that, Margaret reasoned, he must have amassed a considerable fortune. "Emma," she said slowly, "what if the treasure isn't only what he hid on our land? What if there are mines in those mountains where he extracted precious metals?" Emma's eyes widened. "You mean he might have had actual mining claims?" Margaret held up the coded ledger, flipping to several of its most cryptic entries. "Look here. Some of these records point to locations that aren't on our property. What if he operated in several places?" For the next hour, they worked side by side, studying the ledger for patterns that might reveal sites or explain the nature of each entry. Margaret knew Samuel's talent for spotting such patterns could be invaluable, but she was reluctant to wake him. "This symbol appears again and again," Emma noted, pointing at an emblem shaped like a mountain peak topped with a star. "And the entries that follow it always have larger numbers than the rest." Margaret examined the symbol. Mountain locations, perhaps. And the star. Maybe it denoted particularly rich sites. Her mind began to race. If her great-grandfather had mining operations within the national forest above their land, those places might still hold valuable deposits, but they'd be far harder to access legally. "We need to be methodical about this," Margaret said firmly. "Before we decide on the property or Harrison's offer, we must understand exactly what's at stake." Emma nodded. "Have you thought about his deadline? He wants an answer by the end of the week." Margaret didn't want to dwell on the ticking clock, but Emma's question forced her to face it. If we turn him down without knowing what we're giving up, we could regret it forever. But if we accept, then later learn we sold a fortune for a fraction of its worth, the regret would be even greater. Then a thought struck her. "Emma, you know everyone in this valley. Have you ever heard whispers about geological surveys or mining companies showing interest in the area?" Emma paused, searching her memory. "Now that you mention it, in recent months we've had some unusual visitors in town. Men in expensive suits asking questions at the courthouse about property records and mineral rights. At the time, I assumed they were real estate developers hunting for recreational parcels, but they may have been assessing mining potential. She hesitated, then added, "There's more. Last month I saw Harrison having lunch with two out-of-towners. They were studying maps and documents, but when I walked past, they stopped talking and packed their papers away." Margaret felt a growing urgency. If Harrison was working with outside investors familiar with the area's mineral potential, they were operating with far more information than she had. The coded ledger might be the key to understanding her family's true holdings. But time was running out. "Tomorrow," Margaret decided, "Samuel and I will continue following my great-grandfather's map. We need to find the remaining caches and figure out exactly what he left to us." With the facts at hand, they could now make informed choices about the next steps. Emma reached across the table and clasped Margaret's hand firmly. "Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. I'll help however I can." After Emma left, Margaret returned to the coded ledger with renewed determination. She worked late into the night, jotting down notes, experimenting with different cipher-breaking methods. By the time she finally went to bed, she had found recurring patterns that might indicate locations, dates, or quantities. As she drifted off to sleep, her thoughts turned to her great-grandfather, Jeremiah Stone. His complex system had been crafted not just to hide wealth, but to ensure his descendants possessed the insight needed to make thoughtful decisions. Margaret was beginning to realize the true treasure wasn't merely gold and silver. It was the knowledge and preparation he had passed down. Morning would bring new discoveries, but she was growing more certain that her family's future lay not in selling to Harrison's development company, but in understanding and reclaiming their real inheritance. The next day, Margaret found Samuel already in the kitchen. The coded ledger lay open before him, alongside his notebook and a cluster of pencils. He was always an early riser, yet his intense focus showed he had been working for quite some time. "I think I've cracked part of the code," he announced without looking up. Margaret poured herself some coffee and sat beside him, impressed by his systematic approach. Samuel had built charts mapping the frequency of different symbols and was already testing substitution patterns. "Look here," he said, indicating a series of entries from 1934. "These symbols repeat every few weeks, always followed by the same kind of numbers. I think they mark regular trips to the same locations." Margaret studied his findings. The patterns Samuel had spotted had eluded her weary mind the night before. The steady rhythm of certain entries suggested routine activity, perhaps visits to established mining sites. "And here," Samuel continued, turning to a later section of the ledger, "the entries change in 1940. The amounts get higher, and new symbols appear. I think Great-Grandpa expanded his operations during the war years." Margaret recognized that her son's natural talent for puzzles and patterns made him far more adept at decoding the ledger than she. "What do you think the bigger amounts mean?" "Maybe he found richer deposits," Samuel suggested. "Or maybe the prices for precious metals rose during the war, so the same quantities were worth more." His logical reasoning impressed her once again. At 12, Samuel possessed analytical skills that many adults would envy. "According to the treasure map," he said, consulting the documents from their first find, "our next location should be in the foundation of the old barn. Want to check it out?" The barn had collapsed during a harsh winter storm 15 years earlier, leaving only its stone foundation and scattered timbers. Margaret had often meant to clear the rubble, but other priorities had always intervened. Now, the debris-filled site might conceal another piece of the family's puzzle. They walked together toward the barn's remains, the cool morning air carrying the promise of another clear mountain day. Samuel immediately began inspecting the foundation stones, searching for the distinctive symbols that had marked his earlier discoveries. "Here," he called from the eastern corner of the foundation. "The same symbol as before, carved into this cornerstone." Margaret joined him, noting how the carving was placed so it could only be seen from inside the original barn structure. Her great-grandfather had always been meticulous about concealing his markers from casual view. Following the pattern they had learned, they began examining the area around the marked stone, looking for signs of a hidden compartment. It was Margaret who noticed that several stones could be shifted, revealing a hollow space beneath. This cache was different from the previous ones. Instead of documents or tools, it held small leather pouches, each carefully wrapped and labeled. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the first pouch. Inside were silver coins, dozens of them, dating back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many appeared to be rare collector's pieces, worth far more than their weight in silver. "Look at these dates," Samuel said, opening another pouch. "Some of these coins are really old. Great-grandfather must have been collecting them for years." Margaret counted the coins from the first few pouches, estimating their value even without factoring in their rarity. The silver content alone was worth thousands of dollars, and there were more than a dozen pouches. "Samuel," she whispered, "we might be looking at a substantial sum here." But it was the last pouch that truly stole her breath. Wrapped in silk were several small gold nuggets, each tagged with a date and location. Smooth and naturally formed, they gleamed with the hidden wealth of the mountains. Samuel held one up to catch the morning light. "These aren't just flakes like the samples we found before. They're solid pieces." Margaret studied the labels, noticing that all the locations were in the highlands above their property. Great-grandfather had indeed worked the mountain mines, and they had been rich enough to yield sizable nuggets. "We need to research the value of these coins and gold pieces," Margaret said thoughtfully. "But first, let's keep following the map. I want to understand the full scope of what he left us before we make any decisions." They carefully rewrapped the coins and gold, placing everything into a sturdy box that Margaret could hide in the house. As they worked, she couldn't help thinking about the looming deadline. Harrison's offer still stood, but each new discovery made the thought of selling the property increasingly difficult. "Samuel," she asked as they walked back home, "what do you think about Harrison's offer? If we have all this treasure, do we still need to worry about money?" Samuel was silent for a moment, his young mind wrestling with the implications. "I think great-grandfather left this treasure to us for a reason," he said at last. "Maybe he knew one day our family would be pressured to sell the land. Maybe he wanted us to have the means to keep it, if we chose to stay." Margaret was struck by the quiet wisdom in her son's words. Samuel immediately grasped what she was only beginning to understand. The treasure was not just about money. It was about safeguarding the family's legacy and maintaining independence against outside pressures. "There's something else," Samuel added. "The coded ledger shows entries right up until 1943, the same year great-grandfather wrote his last letter. But some of the mountain locations noted in the ledger aren't on our treasure map." Margaret stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "I mean there might be active mining sites where he once worked, places that could still hold valuable deposits. The treasure map only shows hiding spots on our property, but the ledger suggests he also operated in the national forest." The implications struck Margaret like a physical blow. If Jeremiah Stone had once established mining rights in the mountains, those rights could still be legally valid. What they had found so far might be just the beginning of their true inheritance. "We need to research mineral and mining rights," Margaret said, "and we need to do it quickly." That afternoon, Margaret called Dr. Wells and arranged a visit to the county courthouse. If her great-grandfather had registered official mining claims, public records would prove it. As they prepared for the trip, Margaret felt the weight of decisions that could shape not only her and Samuel's future, but potentially the future of Pine Ridge Valley itself. Harrison's development company might be planning to exploit mineral resources that legally belonged to the Stone family. The coded ledger and the growing trove hidden on their land were revealing a truth that changed everything. Her great-grandfather had not been just a miller with a hobby for collecting precious metals. He had been a shrewd mining operator who amassed substantial wealth and took careful steps to ensure it remained in the family. Tomorrow's research at the courthouse might uncover the full scope of their heritage, and with it, the power to resist Harrison's pressure. The county courthouse rose like a fortress of red brick and limestone in the heart of Millfield, Colorado. Margaret drove the winding mountain roads with Dr. Wells beside her and Samuel in the back seat. The three were tense, each feeling the pull of what they might discover in the public archives. Dr. Wells had already called ahead to arrange access to historic mining documents, explaining that their interest was an academic study of the region's geological history. The clerk who greeted them, a helpful woman named Janet Morrison, seemed genuinely excited to assist with what she called one of the most fascinating research requests they'd received in years. "Mining claims from the 1930s and 1940s are truly fascinating," Janet said, as she led them to the record room. "Most people have no idea how much activity happened here during those years. The Depression and then the war created unusual economic conditions that made small-scale mining surprisingly profitable." Margaret's pulse quickened as Janet brought out several thick ledgers and boxes of documents. These records contained every mineral right and mining claim filed in Pine Ridge Valley and the surrounding national forest lands between 1920 and 1950. Dr. Wells took charge of the search. His academic expertise made him swift and precise in navigating the complex filing systems, steadily bringing them closer to uncovering what great-grandfather Stone had left behind. Samuel had proven unexpectedly valuable, his knack for recognizing patterns, allowing him to quickly pinpoint relevant entries as they combed through the chronological records. "Here," said Dr. Wells after about 20 minutes of searching. "Jeremiah Stone, registered on September 15th, 1933. Margaret leaned over Dr. Wells' shoulder as the older woman read from the official record. "Mining claim number 1447, filed for extraction of precious metals on public land adjoining private property in Pine Ridge Valley. Claimant, Jeremiah Stone. Location, Sections 14 and 15, Township 8 North, Range 75 West." "What exactly does that mean?" Margaret asked. Dr. Wells consulted a large county map. "It means your great-grandfather secured official claims on 2 sections of national forest land, right next to your family's property. And Margaret, these aren't small claims. We're talking about a significant stretch of mountain terrain above your mill." Janet Morrison peered over their shoulders. "Wow," she said, clearly impressed. "That's highly unusual. Most claims from that era were small placer operations, individual prospectors working streambeds. This, however, covers a substantial area, and it specifically grants rights for hard rock mining." While the adults discussed the discovery, Samuel continued skimming additional documents. Suddenly, he looked up. "Mom, there are more claims." Much more, Dr. Wells murmured, as she moved closer to examine his findings. Over the next hour, they uncovered that Jeremiah Stone had registered a total of 7 mining claims between 1933 and 1942, covering nearly 3,000 acres of mountain land surrounding Pine Ridge Valley. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Wells said quietly, spreading the maps across the research table. "Your great-grandfather essentially locked down the mineral rights to most of the highlands in this region." Margaret stared at the maps, trying to grasp the scope of what she was seeing. "Are these claims still valid?" Janet opened a reference manual. "Claims from that period remain valid as long as annual maintenance fees are paid and the minimum work requirements are met. Let me check the payment records." The payment history revealed something even more remarkable. Jeremiah Stone had maintained all 7 claims until his death in 1943. After that, the payments continued, made first by Margaret's father until his passing, and then, to her astonishment, by a Denver law firm acting as trustee for the Stone family estate. "I don't understand," Margaret said slowly. "My father never mentioned any mining claims or trust payments." Dr. Wells studied the legal documents more closely. "It appears your great-grandfather created a fund specifically to ensure the claims would be preserved, even if the family wasn't aware of them. Here, this clause states that the mineral rights are to be protected for future generations of the Stone family." Meanwhile, Janet was searching for current information on her laptop. According to the most recent records, all 7 claims are still active and legally valid. The trust is set to keep paying through 2025. Margaret sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what they had uncovered. "Are you telling me my family owns the mineral rights to 3,000 acres of mountain land?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Dr. Wells affirmed calmly. "And based on the geological surveys I've reviewed for that region, those claims likely cover some of the richest mineral deposits in all of Colorado." Samuel was hunched over one of the trust documents. "Mom, listen to this. The mineral rights mentioned above shall be transferred to the direct descendants of Jeremiah Stone, upon presentation of proper identification and compliance with the legal terms stated in this contract." Dr. Wells took the document from Samuel and studied it carefully. His voice carried a note of awe. "Margaret, this is extraordinary. Your great-grandfather didn't just leave a treasure hidden on your land. He granted you the lawful ownership of highly valuable mining operations. You're not simply a property owner." The weight of the revelation seemed to press physically against Margaret's chest. In an instant, her entire situation felt transformed. Harrison's relentless push to buy the factory property, the interest from the development company, even her own financial struggles, all of it looked different now. "How much could these mineral rights be worth?" she asked quietly. Janet Morrison was flipping through reference materials, her eyes bright with excitement. "Well, I can't offer exact figures, but I can tell you similar mineral rights in Colorado have sold for millions of dollars in recent years. With today's precious metal prices and modern extraction technology." She paused, visibly energized by their findings. "Let's just say these claims could be extremely valuable." Dr. Wells spread a geological survey map across the desk, comparing it against the mining claim papers. "Margaret, look here. Your great-grandfather's claims align with areas that recent geological studies have identified as high-probability zones for silver, gold, and rare minerals." "Rare minerals?" Samuel asked. "Elements used in modern electronics and renewable energy technology," Dr. Wells explained. "They're extraordinarily valuable, and demand has surged in the past few years." Margaret felt as if the ground itself had shifted beneath her. She had spent years worrying over the taxes on 20 acres of factory land, never realizing her family's hidden holdings might be worth millions. There's something else, Janet added, scanning a computer screen. These records show recent activity, specific inquiries into these mining claims. Someone has been looking into their status and ownership. What kind of inquiries? Dr. Wells asked. Legal research requests, geological survey consultations, and Janet leaned closer to the monitor. Market valuation assessments. Someone has been analyzing these claims in detail during the past 6 months. Margaret's stomach tightened. 6 months? That's about when Harrison began pressing me to sell the factory property. Dr. Wells and Samuel exchanged a meaningful glance. The timing was far too convenient to be mere coincidence. Janet, Dr. Wells asked carefully, can you determine who made these inquiries? She scrolled through her files. The requests originated from a Denver law firm, Blackwood, Sterling, and Associates. They were acting on behalf of an undisclosed client. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Harrison mentioned a Denver-based development company. What if it's them? Dr. Wells gathered the mining claim documents into a neat stack, his eyes narrowing with resolve. Margaret, I think we need to seriously consider the possibility that Harrison and his development company have known about these mineral rights all along. Their offer to buy the factory property might not be about the building at all. It could be an attempt to secure access to mining concessions worth far more than what they're willing to pay. Samuel sat in silence for a moment, processing everything they had just uncovered. Mom, he said gravely, if we have mining rights worth millions of dollars, and Harrison knows it, then he's basically trying to steal our inheritance. Margaret nodded, a surge of anger tightening her chest, mixed with a fresh sense of resolve. Harrison's constant pressure, his deadlines, the increasingly generous offers, it all made perfect sense now. He hadn't been trying to help her out of financial trouble. He'd been maneuvering to acquire mineral rights for a fraction of their real value. So what do we do now? Margaret asked. Dr. Wells gave a sad, knowing smile. Now, we make sure you claim your inheritance properly and protect it from anyone who might exploit your family. But first, we need to establish the current market value of those claims and clarify your legal position. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Margaret felt as though she were seeing her life in sharp focus for the first time in years. Her great-grandfather hadn't been just a careful man who saved his money. He had been a visionary who secured his family's future for generations. What had started as a treasure hunt, sparked by Samuel finding a hidden letter, had turned into something far greater than gold or silver coins. It had revealed that the Stone family owned assets with the potential to reshape not only their own lives, but the economic landscape of Pine Ridge Valley itself. Harrison's deadline suddenly seemed less like a looming threat and more like an opportunity. When he called for her final answer, Margaret would be ready, with information that could completely shift the balance of power. The drive back to Pine Ridge Valley passed in contemplative silence. Margaret's mind churned with the implications of what they'd discovered. Samuel sat in the passenger seat, carefully organizing the photocopied documents they'd obtained, while Dr. Wells reviewed her research notes. As they rounded the final bend before town, Margaret spoke quietly to Dr. Wells. We need to proceed carefully from here. If Harrison and his associates have been digging into these mineral rights for months, they've probably anticipated the possibility that we might uncover the truth. Margaret tightened her grip on the wheel. What do you think they'll do when they realize we know? That depends on how much money is at stake, Dr. Wells replied sternly, and how far they're willing to go to protect their investment. Pulling into Margaret's driveway, Samuel suddenly pointed toward the mill. "Mom, there's someone down by the water." Margaret's heart skipped as she recognized the figure standing near the family's mill, Thomas Harrison. He faced away from them, inspecting the building's exterior. But he wasn't alone. Two men in expensive suits stood nearby, one snapping photos while the other manipulated what looked like surveying equipment. "Stay in the car," Margaret told Samuel, though from the determined look in his eyes, she suspected he had no intention of obeying. Dr. Wells gently placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Remember, you now have information they don't know you possess. That's your edge." With her heart pounding but her stride steady, Margaret walked the path toward the mill. Harrison turned at the sound of her approaching footsteps, his polished smile appearing instantly, though she noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Stone," he called out with forced cheer. "I hope you don't mind. I've brought a few colleagues to see the property. These gentlemen represent the development company I mentioned." The two men beside Harrison were clearly not locals. Everything about them, from the gleam of their shoes to the calculated sharpness in their expressions, spoke of wealth and corporate power. The older of the two stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Stone, I'm Robert Blackwood of Blackwood, Sterling and Associates," he said smoothly. "We're very interested in your property, and we'd like to discuss some promising opportunities with you." Margaret felt a cold ripple of recognition. It was the same law firm currently investigating her family's mining concessions. She forced her expression into neutrality as her mind raced through the implications of his presence. "What kind of opportunities?" she asked cautiously. Blackwood's smile carried the practiced ease of someone well-versed in persuasion. "Well, beyond the generous offer Mr. Harrison has already presented, we've identified additional potential here. Possibilities that could benefit everyone involved." "Additional potential?" Margaret's voice sharpened slightly. The second man, introducing himself as James Sterling, glanced down at the tablet in his hands. "Our geological consultants believe this area may hold significant mineral development opportunities. If you're willing to include the mineral rights in a potential sale, we're prepared to offer substantially more than the original $300,000. Margaret's pulse quickened, though she kept her tone steady. "Mineral rights? I wasn't aware there were mineral rights associated with this property." Blackwood and Sterling exchanged a swift glance, one that confirmed her suspicion. They already knew exactly what those mineral rights entailed. Now, they were testing her knowledge. "Oh, properties in the mountains often come with mineral considerations," Blackwood said casually. "Most longtime family owners aren't familiar with the technical details, but our research suggests there may be valuable deposits in this region." "And how valuable would that be?" Margaret asked evenly. Sterling consulted his tablet again. "Well, it's hard to say without extensive surveys, but we'd be willing to raise our offer to $500,000 for the complete package, including any mineral rights that may exist." Margaret nearly laughed at their audacity. 500,000 for mineral rights that might be worth tens of millions. She reminded herself of Dr. Wells' advice. Information is power. "That's certainly worth considering," she replied with deliberate neutrality. "But I'd need some time to research exactly what mineral rights this property holds." Blackwood's smile tightened fractionally. "Of course, though I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. Market conditions in development can change overnight." Harrison stepped in, pressing the point. "Miss Stone, with all respect, you've faced financial hardships for years. This could be the security you and your son might never have a chance at again. At that moment, Samuel appeared at her side, apparently ignoring her instruction to stay in the car. He clutched his notebook and several of the documents they had photocopied at the courthouse. "Mom," Samuel said innocently, "should I show them the mining claim documents we found today?" Samuel's words hit the three men like a sudden gust of wind, their reactions immediate and telling. Blackwood's polished composure slipped. Sterling instinctively took a step back, and Harrison's face drained of color. "Mining claim documents?" Blackwood asked, his voice carefully measured. Margaret recognized that Samuel, with the keen instinct of youth, had executed a perfectly timed strategic reveal. There was no longer any doubt. These men were fully aware of her family's mineral rights. "Yes," Margaret said, taking the papers from Samuel's hands. "We were researching our family history and came across some interesting court records today. It seems my great-grandfather had far deeper ties to mining than we realized." Dr. Wells appeared beside them, the weight of her academic credentials lending authority to their stance. "In fact, it's remarkable. The Stone family seems to own substantial mineral rights across this entire region. We're still examining the full scope and current market value." It was clear to Margaret that Blackwood's expression had shifted from confident charm to calculated concern. "What exactly have you uncovered?" he asked. Margaret offered a pleasant smile. "Well, as you've mentioned, market conditions can shift quickly. I think some further research is in order before I make any decision about selling." Sterling was already tapping rapidly on his tablet, likely alerting associates about this unexpected turn. Harrison looked like a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling right before his eyes. "Miss Stone," Blackwood said, his tone growing more serious, "you understand, I hope, that mineral rights can be complex legal matters. It's vital to work with experienced professionals who grasp both regulatory requirements and market realities." "Oh, I fully agree," Margaret replied calmly. "That's why we'll be bringing in attorneys who specialize in mineral rights, along with geological experts, before making any decisions." The three men exchanged glances that carried the urgency of private conversations yet to come. Blackwood handed Margaret an elegant business card. "Please keep us informed about your research. We remain very interested in working with you and are prepared to be quite flexible in our arrangements." When the men departed, Margaret, Samuel, and Dr. Wells gathered in the kitchen to process what had just transpired. "They know," Dr. Wells said plainly. "They know exactly what rights exist, and they're planning to acquire them for far less than they're worth." Samuel studied the card Blackwood had left. "Mom, this is the same law firm we saw digging through our mining grants at the courthouse." Margaret nodded gravely. "They've probably been planning this for months, maybe years. They've researched our finances, spotted our vulnerabilities, and approached us at the moment they believed we'd be most likely to sell." "What do we do now?" Samuel asked. Dr. Wells was already reaching for her phone. "Now we level the playing field. I'll call a colleague who specializes in mineral rights law. It's time you had professional representation working for your interests, not against them." Margaret felt a surge of determination. For years, she had carried the weight of financial strain and the quiet judgment of the community. But at this moment, she understood. She was not a desperate woman clinging to worthless land. She was the owner of valuable property, assets others were eager to steal. "There's one more thing we need to do," Margaret realized. "We have to complete my great-grandfather's treasure map. If Blackwood and his associates are willing to offer $500,000 for mineral rights worth millions, there's no telling what they'd do to stop us from claiming our full inheritance." Samuel's eyes lit up with understanding. The final cache. According to the map, there's still one more location. Dr. Wells looked up from her phone, where she had been making arrangements. What's at the last site? Margaret unfolded the original map they'd found by the stream. According to his notes, it's where the original documents are kept, the papers that officially transfer all mineral rights to his descendants. Then that's our priority, Dr. Wells said firmly. We must find those documents before Blackwood's people realize we don't yet have complete legal control. Margaret turned toward the window, her gaze resting on the old mill. Its familiar silhouette now symbolized not just family heritage, but substantial wealth and influence. Her great-grandfather had foreseen this day, knowing future generations might face pressure to surrender their birthright. Tomorrow they would locate the final treasure and claim what Jeremiah Stone had left for them. That night, Margaret slept with the certainty that she was no longer clinging to a crumbling past. She was fighting to secure a prosperous future her family rightfully deserved. Dawn rose gray and misty over Pine Ridge Valley, but Margaret had been awake for hours. Standing at the kitchen window, she watched as the factory emerged from the morning fog, her coffee cooling in her hands. Today would decide whether her family claimed its rightful legacy or lost it all to corporate manipulation. Samuel appeared in the doorway, already dressed, his notebook in hand. Despite the gravity of the moment, or perhaps because of it, his expression carried a spark of excitement. I've been studying the final location on my great-grandfather's map, he said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. It's unlike all the others. Margaret joined him, noting the symbols he had circled. The earlier caches had been marked with simple indicators, but this one was covered with multiple symbols and what appeared to be detailed instructions. What do you think it means? She asked. Samuel traced the markings with his finger. I think this spot requires solving a puzzle before we can reach the treasure. See here? These symbols correspond to specific parts of the mill's structure, and these numbers could be measurements or coordinates. Margaret leaned in, studying the notes with care. Her great-grandfather had indeed crafted a more elaborate challenge for the final cache. The symbols referenced the millstones, the waterwheel, and what seemed like astronomical markers, positions of the sun or moon aligning with architectural features. These were safeguards, protecting the most important documents of all. She realized then that the original mineral rights papers were the most valuable legacy he had left behind. A knock at the kitchen door broke their concentration. On the porch stood Emma, and she wasn't alone. A distinguished woman in her early 60s accompanied them, carrying a folder and radiating the confident composure of someone well-versed in complex legal matters. Margaret, Emma said as they stepped inside. This is attorney Sarah Morrison, sister to Janet from the courthouse. She specializes in mineral rights law. Sarah Morrison had driven overnight from Denver after Dr. Wells reached out about the Stone family's situation. Her reputation for defending landowners against corporate exploitation had made her one of Colorado's most respected mineral rights attorneys. Miss Stone, Morrison began, taking a seat at the kitchen table. Dr. Wells briefed me on your case. I've reviewed the preliminary documents, and I must say, your great-grandfather was exceptionally thorough in safeguarding the family's interests. Margaret felt a surge of hope. So we can legally claim the mineral rights. Based on what I've seen so far, absolutely, Morrison replied. The mining claims were properly registered and maintained in line with federal requirements. The trust's structure is legally sound. She paused, glancing at her notes. However, we'll need the original transfer documents to finalize everything. Without them, Blackwood's attorneys could challenge your claim in court, delaying resolution for years. Samuel leaned forward, tension in his voice. We know where the originals are hidden. We just have to solve our great-grandfather's final puzzle. Morrison examined the treasure map with professional curiosity. Jeremiah Stone clearly understood how critical those documents were. If Blackwood's team has been investigating your claims for months, they may have also been searching for those transfer papers. A chill ran through Margaret. Do you think they might have found them already? It's possible, Morrison admitted. But if your great-grandfather was as meticulous as these clues suggest, he likely designed the final hiding place so only family members with specific knowledge of the mill could access it. Emma traced the puzzle's symbols thoughtfully. Margaret, some of these markings look familiar. Didn't your father teach you how to read the mill's seasonal alignments? Margaret's eyes widened with sudden realization. Yes. Her father had taught her how the windows and doors of the mill were positioned to track seasonal changes, knowledge every miller needed to optimize grain drying and storage. Astronomical markers. Of course, Margaret exclaimed. He included the seasonal alignments in the puzzle knowing this skill would be passed down through the family. Samuel was already calculating angles and measurements from the puzzle's symbols. If we're right, we'll need to be inside the mill at a very specific time of day, when the sun's position creates the exact shadows and light patterns the clues describe. What time frame are we looking at? Morrison asked, checking her watch. Margaret consulted her father's old notes on the mill's seasonal features. Based on the puzzle's date references, I believe we need to be there around 10 in the morning, when the autumn sun hits the angle specified by my great-grandfather. As they prepared to leave for the mill, Morrison offered a final caution. Be aware. The Blackwood people may be watching your movements closely. If they suspect they're close to finding the original documents, they might try to interfere, Margaret said, her gaze shifting from her son's determined face to the loyal friends gathered around them. Then we'd better make sure we find them first. The group moved steadily toward the old mill, the morning mist thinning as the sun climbed higher. Margaret clutched the enigmatic map left by her great-grandfather, while Samuel carried a notebook packed with careful calculations. Emma and Morrison walked alongside, offering moral support and legal knowledge. Somewhere within the mill's meticulously designed structure lay the final hiding place, protected by a puzzle only family members could solve. As they approached, Margaret felt the weight of the Stone family's generations pressing on her shoulders. For over 80 years, sunlight had streamed through the mill's precisely placed windows, transforming its interior each morning. Standing at the very center of the grinding floor, she watched the golden beams form intricate patterns. Patterns her father had taught her to read decades ago. Samuel moved deliberately through the space, consulting his notebook and measuring angles, comparing them to the symbols etched on the mysterious map. The light is hitting the eastern grinding stone exactly where the map indicates, he reported. If my readings are correct, we need to wait about 15 more minutes for the sun to reach the perfect position. Morrison lingered by the door, alert to any sign of unwanted visitors, while Emma examined the fine details of the mill's architecture. This place had long served a dual purpose: a working grain mill for local farmers and an educational center where visitors could learn traditional milling techniques and discover the region's mining history. A short time later, Samuel emerged from the mill, his clothes dusted with flour and his face bright with satisfaction. At just 13, he already carried himself like someone who understood the thrill of uncovering a family secret.